History doesn't always change in palaces or hope. Sometimes it changes when a crowd collectively says, nope. In that moment, a chariot race becomes a citywide flame. 7 jailed inmates give revolution a name. A traffic stop spirals into 6 days of blame. Different sparks, same story, same explosive game. Today we're counting the riots that didn't just shatter glass, they cracked the timeline, kicked history's ass. These are moments when the crowd finally snaps and the rules disintegrate. And then civilization becomes a group chat, no mods, no mute, just chaos at scale. So let's dive into 5 of the most explosive riots that literally made history. 1. The Boston Massacre, 1770. 5 deaths that lit the fuse of revolution. Moving forward, we have the Boston Massacre. In 1770, Boston was an occupied city bristling with resentments. The American colonists were furious over Britain's taxes, like the Townshend Acts without representation. To enforce order, Britain had stationed red-coated troops in Boston since 1768. This was a daily insult to proud Bostonians. Soldiers bivouacked in their city streets, competing for local jobs off hours and occasionally clashing with locals in barroom brawls. Tensions kept rising. Just 11 days earlier, a British sympathizer had shot and killed an 11-year-old boy, Christopher Sider, during a protest, and his huge funeral had further inflamed anti-British anger. Boston's patriots, led by men like Samuel Adams, were itching for a confrontation, and British troops were on edge in a hostile environment. Into this powder keg wandered a lone British sentry on the night of March 5, 1770. That evening, a young private named Hugh White stood guard outside the customs house on King Street. A group of angry colonists began heckling him, hurling insults and snowballs. As the crowd grew in number, ranging from 50 to 100 and then 300 people, the taunts grew fiercer. "Lobster backs!" They jeered at the red-coated soldier, daring him to fire. Private White, pelted by icy missiles, finally called for backup. A corporal and 6 soldiers under Captain Thomas Preston arrived, bayonets fixed, and formed a defensive line. The crowd, now several hundred strong, did not back down. Instead, they pressed closer, brandishing sticks and clubs. Some witnesses later swore they heard someone cry, "Fire, you cowards!" Others said it was the mob yelling, "Fire!" sarcastically. Amid the commotion, a club struck one soldier and he slipped, discharging his musket into the crowd. That was the fatal moment. Whether by panic or eager malice, the other soldiers began shooting directly into the mob without Captain Preston's order. When the smoke cleared on King Street, 5 colonists lay dead or dying. Hardly a massacre by body count, but a momentous outrage nonetheless. Among the first to fall was Crispus Attucks, a mixed-race sailor of African and indigenous lineage, who ironically became known as the first martyr of the American Revolution. The enraged crowd dispersed only when acting Governor Hutchinson promised an inquiry, and the terrified British soldiers retreated. The next day, Boston was in an uproar. Bells rang, and thousands attended a town meeting demanding the troops withdraw from the city. British authorities, keen to avoid a full-scale revolt, agreed to move the regiment to an island in the harbor. But the real chaos was just beginning in the realm of public opinion. Patriot propagandists seized on the incident with glee. Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, and their colleagues brilliantly spun the narrative, dubbing the incident the Bloody Massacre, and circulating sensational engravings that depicted cold-blooded redcoats firing into a peaceful crowd. Paul Revere's famous engraving showed British soldiers firing in unison on well-dressed townsfolk, blood pooling on the cobblestones, an image of tyrannical cruelty that only loosely fit the messy reality. Never mind that the colonists had been throwing rocks and clubs. In the propaganda, it was a slaughter of innocents. The term massacre stuck. In taverns and meeting halls from Massachusetts to Georgia, colonists seethed at this proof that the mother country was willing to kill those who dared protest. In the short run, the British soldiers involved faced justice of a sort, but in a sign of colonial fair-mindedness or irony, they were defended by none other than patriot lawyer John Adams. Adams, to the rule of law, argued the soldiers had fired in self-defense against a threatening mob. Thanks to his defense, 6 of the 8 soldiers were acquitted, and 2 were convicted only of manslaughter. John Adams later noted that his legal advocacy cost him popularity, but he believed it one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country. Despite this outcome, the incident's real impact was in fueling the revolutionary fire. As Adams famously reflected, the foundation of American independence was laid on March 5, 1770. For the next 5 years, every March 5th, Bostonians held solemn anniversary memorials for what they called Massacre Day. This day was aimed at fanning anti-British sentiment and keeping the anger fresh. The Boston Massacre became a kind of revolutionary meme, the image of redcoat brutality galvanizing colonial unity. Indeed, it was 5 years later that the first battles of the Revolutionary War broke out, but by then the colonists' hearts were hardened against King George III's rule. In a darkly ironic twist, the so-called massacre's death toll, which included the death of only 5 persons, was modest. Yet it achieved exactly what Sam Adams and company wanted. It massacred any loyalty remaining toward the crown. As one historian Riley put it, calling the scuffle a massacre was one of the most effective marketing moves in history. The riot's victims, Attucks, Gray, Caldwell, Maverick, Carr, became martyrs whose blood cried out for liberty. In the end, this crowd's snap in a colonial street brawl did not topple a government overnight, but it changed the course of history by lighting the fuse of the American Revolution. Not bad for a cold night's quarrel over a century and some snowballs. 2. Partition riots, 1947, British India. Freedom and fratricide on the road to partition. And then there is the partition riots, which, in August 1947, after 300 years of colonial rule, the British finally agreed to quit India. But with independence came a fateful decision: partition, dividing the subcontinent into two new nations, predominantly Hindu India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. This divide was supposed to address communal tensions between Hindus and Muslims that the British claimed had become irreconcilable. Unfortunately, those very tensions had been stoked by years of sectarian politics and the British strategy of divide and rule. As the partition plan was rushed through, nobody quite knew where the new border would fall. The final lines were literally announced after independence, sowing maximum confusion. In the lead-up, mistrust and fear between communities were at a fever pitch. Rumors flew in Punjab and Bengal, the provinces being split, that minorities would be slaughtered or expelled once the other side took charge. It was a recipe for panic and preemptive violence. Even before the formal partition, horrific riots had already erupted. The Great Calcutta Killing in August 1946 saw some 4,000 die in Hindu-Muslim clashes. Retaliatory massacres followed in Noakhali, Bihar, and elsewhere. Mass migrations began as people fled anticipated violence, but retaliatory cycles quickly escalated. Blood train stories, carriages arriving full of corpses, spread terror, prompting more attacks on trains, caravans, and villages. Forced migrations occurred on an enormous scale, with attacks on trains and caravans leading to horrific violence across Punjab and Bengal. Communities turned on neighbors in cycles of revenge killings, rapes, and looting. The violence displaced between 12 and 20 million people along religious lines, creating overwhelming refugee crises. Estimates of deaths vary greatly, ranging from 200,000 to 2 million, with most scholars accepting around 1 million killed in the partition violence. The worst violence occurred in Punjab. The partition reshaped demographics, created long-term India-Pakistan rivalry, and left deep trauma. Two nations were born, and millions paid the delivery fee. 3. Watts riots, 1965, Los Angeles. A traffic stop became 6 days of fire. And here comes the shocker. It will surprise you to know that in 1965, the predominantly black neighborhood of Watts in Los Angeles simmered with deep frustration. Residents faced widespread housing and job discrimination, substandard schools, high unemployment, and tense relations with police marked by frequent brutality and lack of trust. These long-standing grievances had built up over years, with urban unrest already flaring in other cities in 1964 and 1965. On the evening of August 11, 1965, 21-year-old Marquette Fry was pulled over by a white California Highway Patrol officer for suspected drunk driving near Avalon Boulevard and 116th Street. Fry resisted arrest, and a scuffle broke out involving his brother Ronald and their mother, who arrived on the scene. A growing crowd gathered. Tensions escalated, with rumors of excessive police force spreading rapidly. What started as a confrontation quickly exploded into widespread rioting, looting, arson, and violence across Watts and surrounding south-central areas. Fires raged, buildings burned, and clashes with police intensified. The unrest lasted 6 days, turning parts of the city into a war zone. The California Army National Guard was mobilized with nearly 14,000 troops to restore order, creating a heavily militarized environment. The riots resulted in 34 deaths, mostly black residents, over 1,000 injuries, nearly 4,000 arrests, and more than $40 million in property damage, equivalent to hundreds of millions today, with around 1,000 buildings destroyed. The McCone Commission later investigated, highlighting deep-rooted issues like poverty, discrimination, and poor policing as core causes rather than outside agitators. The events set a precedent for future urban uprisings in the late 1960s and influenced discussions on civil rights and economic justice. The city called it law and order. The neighborhood called it finally being heard. 4. Stonewall riots, 1969, NYC. The night the raid got raided back. And this where it gets even darker. In 1969, LGBTQ people in New York City faced widespread criminalization of homosexuality, routine police harassment, and raids on gay bars. The Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village served as one of the few precarious refuges for gay men, lesbians, transgender individuals, and others, though it was mafia-owned and often targeted by authorities enforcing anti-sodomy laws and gender expression rules. In the early hours of June 28, 1969, police raided the Stonewall Inn, arresting staff for selling liquor without a license and roughing up patrons. Several people were taken into custody, including those not wearing gender-appropriate clothing. As patrons were lined up outside the crowd, patrons and onlookers refused to disperse. A pivotal moment came when someone reportedly shouted, "Why don't you guys do something?" sparking resistance. The situation flipped. Patrons fought back, throwing objects like coins, bottles, and bricks at police. Officers barricaded themselves inside the bars. The crowd grew and clashed over several nights. Demonstrators outmaneuvered police with surreal scenes including a kick line of drag queens taunting riot shields in mockery. The unrest waxed and waned for about 6 days, marking a rare and defiant pushback against routine oppression. The riots galvanized the modern gay liberation movement. Within months, groups like the Gay Liberation Front formed, shifting from quiet assimilation to open activism. The first Pride marches took place a year later in 1970, commemorating Stonewall and accelerating global LGBTQ rights efforts. History changed because the police picked the wrong bar, on the wrong night, in the wrong neighborhood. 5. Soweto Uprising, 1976, South Africa. Students challenged the regime, and the regime panicked. Finally, we have the Soweto Uprising under apartheid. Black South Africans endured systemic segregation and inferior Bantu education, designed to limit opportunities. In 1976, the government mandated Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor, as a medium of instruction in black schools, alongside English, fueling outrage among students already facing overcrowded classrooms and substandard resources. On June 16, 1976, over 10,000 people plus up to 20,000 students in Soweto marched peacefully to protest the Afrikaans policy. Police intercepted the crowd, using tear gas and then live ammunition when students responded with stones. Among the first killed were 15-year-old Hastings Ndlovu and 12-year-old Hector Peterson, whose dying image being carried by a fellow student was photographed by Sam Nzima and became an international symbol of apartheid brutality. The initial shooting sparked pandemonium, with protests spreading rapidly across Soweto townships and then nationwide. Clashes escalated as students, workers, and residents confronted police and state forces. Violence included stone throwing, arson, and heavy state crackdowns, with imagery of children facing armed police shocking the world. Official counts cited 176+ deaths in Soweto alone, but estimates reached 575 nationwide by early 1977, with some higher, plus over 1,000 injured. The uprising drew massive international condemnation, intensified anti-apartheid activism, and marked a turning point that accelerated the regime's eventual downfall in 1994. A government that feared students more than injustice picked the wrong enemy. What makes a riot history-changing? These riots share patterns: long pressure buildups from systemic grievances, then a seemingly small spark. Snowballs in Boston, a traffic stop in Watts, a bar raid at Stonewall, a language mandate in Soweto that ignited rapid escalation through rumors, powerful symbols, and often brutal state overreaction. The aftershocks reshaped regimes, sparked movements, redefined identities, and redrew borders or social lines. A riot isn't just violence, it's a society's stress test, failing in public. Which one of these riots changed history the most, and which one feels like it could happen again? Comment on your pick. And don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.